Hello, curious souls. I'm the Nat storyteller, here to share a tale with you tonight. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. The wind howled through the trees, the night air cold against your skin. In the distance, you hear something, a faint rustling sound, but when you look, there's nothing there. Then, a voice whispers your name. Could it be your mind playing tricks on you, or is something else lurking in the dark, waiting for you to make the wrong move? What would you do if you were trapped in a place where your own fears became reality? Stay tuned, because what happens next might just make you question everything. Keep watching, you won't believe what happens next. Henry had never been one to believe in the supernatural. Sure, he'd heard the stories, tales of ghosts, curses, and things that go bump in the night, but to him, they were just stories. Children's tales, passed down from generation to generation to keep people from wandering too far into the unknown. But tonight was different. It all started with a dare. Watson, always the instigator, had been the first to suggest it. "We're all going to the old forest," he had said, his voice full of mischievous confidence. "It's just a bunch of trees and shadows. What's the worst that could happen?" Steve and James, both eager for some adventure, were quick to agree. But Henry? He was hesitant. There had always been something unsettling about that place, a place where no one went, not even the bravest souls. The old forest had a name. It was called the Whispering Woods, a place avoided by everyone in town. Locals would talk in hushed tones about strange lights that flickered between the trees at night, about the eerie sounds that echoed from deep within. They said the forest was cursed. But Henry wasn't like the others. He didn't believe in curses, ghosts, or any of that nonsense. He was logical. Rational. The kind of person who found comfort in facts and science. So, when the dare was issued, he shrugged it off. "Fine," he said, forcing a grin, "I'll go, but only to prove you're all just making up stories." That was before he stepped into the forest. The moment his feet touched the overgrown path leading into the woods, Henry felt an immediate shift in the air. It was subtle at first, like a change in pressure, but unmistakable. The evening air had been crisp, fresh, but now it felt heavy, thick, almost suffocating. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching out like the gnarled fingers of something ancient and angry. As he walked further into the forest, the sounds of the outside world, cars passing, distant voices, faded away, leaving an eerie silence in its place. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Henry's flashlight flickered in his hand, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance on their own accord. He shook the light, hoping to get a steady beam, but it didn't help. The darkness here felt different, oppressive in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Guys?" His voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. No response. He paused, scanning the darkness around him. He should turn back. This wasn't fun anymore. But he couldn't. Something held him there, something deep within him urged him forward, as if the forest itself was calling him in. A rustling sound echoed from behind him. Henry spun around, heart racing. His eyes scoured the trees, but there was nothing. Not even the breeze was moving the branches. He took a step forward, then another. The whispers began. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but gradually they grew louder, more distinct. "Henry." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He spun around again, this time his breath hitching in his chest. He was certain he heard his name. No one was behind him. "Hello." His voice cracked as he called out to his friends. Still no response. Panic began to creep in. Then, the whispers returned, only this time, they weren't just calling his name. They were murmuring something else. Something in a language he couldn't understand. It sounded ancient, like an incantation, each word carrying a weight that seemed to press down on his chest. His heart pounded in his ears as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. It was as if they were all around him, closing in. He wanted to run, to get out of there, but his legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was holding him in place. Another rustling sound came from behind him, but this time it was closer. He spun around quickly, flashlight raised, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees. His breath came faster now, his body trembling with a fear he couldn't explain. The whispers were getting louder, but they weren't just whispers anymore. They were words, broken, frantic, desperate. "Help me." Henry froze. The voice sounded real now, not just in his head. It was coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Who's there?" His voice trembled as he called out into the void. His mind raced. He had to be hearing things. It was the wind. It was the trees. But then the voice came again, clearer this time. "Henry, they're coming for you." The flashlight flickered once more, casting long, erratic shadows across the ground. Henry's stomach twisted into knots. His heart was racing, but his feet wouldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the darkness, as if something was waiting for him just beyond the beam of light. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be coming from inside his mind. "Henry, they're right behind you." A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck, icy and unnatural. Henry spun around, his chest tightening. But there was no one. Only the forest. The trees stood still, their branches twisting like reaching hands. But the feeling didn't leave. That cold, suffocating presence. It was there. Watching him. Waiting for him to make a move. He could hear it now, a low, guttural sound, like the wind, but it wasn't. It was something else. Something alive. In that moment, Henry knew. He was not alone. And whatever was in the forest with him didn't want him to leave. Without thinking, he bolted. He didn't look back, didn't stop to listen to the voices that followed him, growing louder, more desperate, like a million unseen eyes tracking his every move. But the deeper he ran, the darker it became. The trees closed in on him. He stumbled, tripping over roots that seemed to reach out and grab at him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The voices were louder now, chanting his name, and Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. His breath was ragged, his legs burning, but he couldn't stop. He had to get out. He reached the clearing, the exit in sight. But something made him stop. It wasn't the fear, or the darkness, it was the feeling. That feeling he couldn't shake. Something was wrong. A shape moved at the edge of the clearing. It was tall. Too tall. Henry froze. The shadows shifted. The air turned icy. It wasn't a person. Not a person at all. And just as he turned to run, everything went black. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as if the very air had been stolen from his lungs. His eyes snapped open, but the darkness that greeted him was absolute, thick like a suffocating blanket. For a moment, he thought he might still be in the forest, trapped in some kind of nightmare. But then the realization hit him, he wasn't in the woods anymore. The ground beneath him was cold, hard, and unyielding. His fingers scraped against the rough surface, desperate to find some sense of stability. His heart raced, a primal fear clawing at his insides. Where was he? What had happened? He tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey, heavy with exhaustion, disoriented, as if waking from a deep, unshakable slumber. The air smelled damp and stagnant, the scent of decaying leaves and wet earth seeping into his nostrils. And yet, despite the overwhelming darkness, he felt, watched. A soft scuttling sound echoed in the distance, just at the edge of his hearing. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, just the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. Henry's pulse quickened, but it wasn't just fear that gripped him. It was curiosity. Something told him this wasn't just an ordinary forest. Something told him that whatever had brought him here, whatever had been waiting for him in the shadows, was not finished with him. Then, as if on cue, a voice whispered from somewhere in the blackness, cold and familiar. "Henry." He froze. His breath hitched in his throat, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. It was the same voice. The voice from the forest. The one that had called to him, that had sent him running. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he strained his ears, listening for any clue as to where the voice was coming from. But the darkness was all-consuming, and no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't see anything beyond the black void that surrounded him. "Who's there?" His voice barely rose above a whisper, shaking with fear. No answer. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was, watching him, too. The scuttling sound came again, this time closer. A skittering of feet, as if something small and quick was crawling toward him. He tensed, ready to jump to his feet, to run, but there was nowhere to go. He could only feel the growing pressure of unseen eyes bearing down on him. Suddenly, a low growl pierced the stillness. It was distant at first, like the sound of something heavy shifting in the dark. But then it grew louder, closer. Henry's chest tightened with dread as the growl transformed into something worse, a deep, guttural rumble that reverberated through his bones. He opened his mouth to scream, but the words died in his throat. His body felt like it was trapped in molasses, heavy, slow, and completely paralyzed. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. The growl was now accompanied by a scraping sound, like claws dragging across stone. It was getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The growl, the skittering, the pressure in the air, it all vanished in an instant, leaving nothing but a suffocating silence. Henry's mind raced. Had he imagined it? Had the terror from the forest finally pushed him past his breaking point? Was this all in his head? But deep down, he knew. Whatever was happening, it was real. And it was far from over. The air seemed to shift again. It grew colder, and Henry felt it, a presence. Something was moving in the darkness, just out of his reach. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something far more sinister. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out everything else as his mind tried to make sense of what was happening. Was he still in the forest? Was he dead? His thoughts were interrupted by another whisper, this one softer, almost pleading. "Henry, help me." His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the voice of a stranger. It wasn't the same voice he had heard before. This one was different. Familiar. Desperate. It was the voice of his friend, Watson. "Watson." Henry whispered, his voice trembling. "Watson, where are you?" There was no response. But then the whisper came again, closer this time, urgent and filled with pain. "Please. Henry, help me." Henry's mind reeled. Was Watson still in the forest? Had he been caught by whatever force was lurking in the shadows? Without thinking, Henry stood up, his body screaming in protest as his legs wobbled beneath him. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, but he couldn't stay here. He had to find his friends. He had to get out of whatever nightmare this was. The ground beneath him shifted as he took a step forward. His foot sank slightly into the soft earth, as if the ground was absorbing him, pulling him deeper into the dark. He took another step. And another. The air grew colder with each movement, until his breath came out in visible puffs of mist. He was sure now, the temperature was dropping rapidly. Whatever was in the forest wasn't just toying with him. It was trying to pull him in, to trap him here with it. Suddenly, a shape appeared in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, a darker patch in the abyss of black. But then it shifted, growing more distinct, more human. Henry's heart raced as the figure grew larger, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. The more he watched, the more it seemed like the figure was struggling to escape the darkness, as if the forest itself were trying to consume it whole. The shape stopped moving, standing perfectly still now, just at the edge of his vision. Then, the voice came again, this time from the figure. "Henry, don't come any closer." It was Watson's voice, there was no mistaking it. But it was different. Distorted, somehow. As if something was twisting it, warping it into something not quite human. Henry's feet froze. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, to turn and flee, but his legs refused to move. "Henry, please." Watson's voice cracked, this time breaking into a series of sharp, disjointed gasps. "They're coming. You need to leave." Henry's heart pounded in his chest as the figure began to fade back into the darkness, its shape dissolving like smoke. He was alone again. But the forest wasn't empty. Not anymore. The whispers started up again, this time, louder, more frantic. They weren't just voices. They were commands. Please. Screams. And they were all around him. Henry's mind screamed for him to leave, to escape whatever was hunting him, but it was too late. The forest had already claimed him. Henry's heart hammered against his ribcage as he stumbled backward, the blood draining from his face. His legs felt like jelly, unable to support his weight. He spun around, searching desperately for any sign of escape, but the darkness was overwhelming. The shadows twisted and writhed, as if they were alive, crawling toward him with unseen hands. The whispers had stopped. But Henry knew in the pit of his stomach, that the silence was worse. The absence of sound made everything feel more sinister, more dangerous. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. A soft rustling came from behind him, faint but unmistakable. Henry froze, his body rigid with fear. His eyes darted from side to side, trying to pierce the blackness, but there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive weight of the night. Then, he heard it again. A low, slithering sound. A slow drag of something heavy, scraping against the earth. It was getting closer. Henry's breath hitched, and his body tensed as the noise grew louder, closer. Whatever it wasn't just watching him anymore. It was hunting him. He could feel its presence creeping up behind him, a malevolent force moving closer with each passing second. Without thinking, he spun around, fists clenched, ready to fight whatever was lurking in the darkness. And there, just in front of him, in the blackest part of the forest, was a figure. A shadow. A shape. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but Henry could see its outline clearly. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, ending in hands that seemed to twitch with anticipation. The thing's body was hunched, like a predator stalking its prey. But what terrified Henry the most were the eyes. Two glowing orbs, bright and cold, fixed on him with an unblinking stare. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. Henry's throat tightened, his mouth dry. A cold sweat broke out across his skin, and for the first time, he felt truly powerless. His legs trembled, refusing to carry him away from the creature. He couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. The creature's eyes seemed to pierce through him, reading his every fear, every thought. He wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in his throat, lodged there like a choking breath he couldn't expel. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world around him seemed to blur, and he felt as though he was trapped in a nightmare, one where he couldn't wake up, no matter how hard he tried. Then, the creature moved. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, jerking like a puppet on strings, and it took a step toward him. Just one step, but it felt like the ground shook beneath him. The thing was moving faster now, its feet scraping the ground with a sickening sound. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He had to run. He had to. Before he could take a step, the creature lunged. The force of the movement was like a bolt of lightning, fast and brutal. Henry barely had time to react as something cold and slick wrapped around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. He screamed, his voice a raw, desperate cry that echoed through the empty woods. But no one could hear him. He scrambled, his hands searching for anything to grab onto, anything that could stop the creature from dragging him into the abyss. His fingers brushed against the earth, but it was too late. The thing was stronger. Its grip tightened, pulling him further into the darkness. Henry fought with everything he had, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The more he struggled, the tighter the thing's grip became, as if the very ground was trying to swallow him whole. His vision blurred, his mind spinning, and for a split second, he thought he saw a flash of something, a face, pale and twisted, grinning at him from the shadows. A voice whispered, low and guttural, just inches from his ear. "You shouldn't have come here." Henry's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked up, and for the first time, he saw the thing's face. It was not human. It was worse. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for its body. Its teeth were jagged, sharp, gleaming in the dim light like a predator's. But the worst part, what truly froze Henry's blood, was the smile. The twisted, unnatural smile that stretched across its face, too wide, too hungry. And then, with a sickening crack, the creature's jaw unhinged, opening impossibly wide. Before Henry could react, the creature's mouth closed around his face, swallowing him whole. Everything went dark. Henry awoke to a blinding pain that shot through his skull, his head feeling as though it were being crushed beneath an immense weight. His body was numb, as if he were floating, yet the cold, damp sensation beneath him made it clear he was still very much alive. Panic surged through him. He shot up, gasping for air, only to find himself not in the forest but in an unfamiliar, dimly lit room. His surroundings were suffocating. The walls were closing in on him, painted in a sickly shade of yellow, and the floor beneath him was cold, wet stone. The air was stale, thick with the scent of decay. It felt like the walls themselves were pressing inward, trapping him in this suffocating, forgotten place. He glanced around frantically, but the only thing he could see clearly was a flickering light overhead, hanging from a single exposed wire. Shadows crept along the edges of the room like something alive, reaching toward him with twisted, clawed fingers. Where was he? His thoughts were scattered, his mind struggling to make sense of the horror he had just endured. The last thing he remembered was being dragged into the darkness by that thing, its skeletal hands clutching him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. But now, he was here. Was it a dream? Was he hallucinating? Henry pushed himself up from the cold floor, his legs shaky as he tried to steady himself. His body felt strange, almost foreign, as though it didn't belong to him anymore. He moved cautiously, his breath shallow, heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt like it might be his last. The room was eerily silent, and yet Henry could feel something that wasn't right. A presence. He spun around, scanning the corners of the room, his eyes falling on a door, an old, rusted door, with bars on the windows, almost like a cell. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the wood rotting, splintered in places, but it was the only way out. Or so he hoped. But something about it seemed wrong. There was something unnatural about that door, as if it was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. As he took a hesitant step toward it, a cold gust of wind slammed against his back, and the door creaked, slowly, loudly, as though it was warning him. Henry froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His body tensed, ready to spring into action, but he felt paralyzed. He wasn't alone. He could feel it, the eyes of the room bearing down on him, but there was no one there. No living thing. And yet, the air was thick with the pressure of unseen eyes watching him, analyzing his every move. The shadows shifted again. He whipped around, his pulse racing. The flickering light above cast strange, elongated shadows, and Henry thought he saw movement. Just out of the corner of his eye. He couldn't make out what it was, but the movement was deliberate, calculated. It wasn't the wind. The sound of a whisper, soft and barely audible, made his blood run cold. Not safe yet. The word slithered through the air, curling into Henry's mind like a serpent, twisting, suffocating his thoughts. He couldn't tell if they were real or just a figment of his imagination. But the voice, it sounded so close. So close that it sent an icy shiver down his spine. Without thinking, Henry bolted toward the door. He wasn't about to wait around to find out what else was in this forsaken place. His hand gripped the rusted handle, but when he tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Desperation clawed at him, and he hammered on the door with his fists, but it was no use. The door wouldn't open. Then he heard it. A soft shuffle, a dragging sound, coming from behind him. Henry spun around, panic seizing his chest. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the shadowy figure emerging from the darkness. The same thing. The creature from the woods. But now, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a form. A shape. And it was closer. Much closer. It glided toward him, its movements unnatural, its limbs twisting and jerking in ways that were wrong. The air around it seemed to warp, bending and distorting with each movement it made. Its eyes, those glowing orbs, were fixed on Henry. They burned through him, cold and malevolent. Henry's legs screamed at him to run, but he was frozen in place. He could feel the weight of the creature's gaze on him, the force of its stare crushing him, holding him in place. His body refused to obey him, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what was standing before him. Then, the creature opened its mouth. The gaping maw was filled with jagged teeth, impossibly large, each one sharper than the last. It grinned, wide and cruel, a twisted smile that seemed to stretch beyond what was humanly possible. Henry's stomach lurched, and the room spun around him. He couldn't look away. He couldn't move. And then, it spoke. "You're mine now." The voice was guttural, inhuman, and it echoed in Henry's mind, reverberating in his skull, shaking him to his core. Just as the creature lunged forward, Henry's mind snapped back into focus. He screamed and scrambled backward, his hands desperately trying to find purchase on the slick floor. His heart raced, each beat pounding in his ears like a drum. The creature was too fast. It was upon him in an instant. Henry's hands shot out, grabbing hold of something, a loose piece of metal from the floor, and with a desperate cry, he swung it at the creature. The force of the strike caught the thing off guard, sending it staggering back, just enough to give Henry the space he needed. He turned and ran, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. He didn't know where the door would lead, but it didn't matter. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. But as he reached the door, he heard a sound that froze him in his tracks. A slow, methodical clapping. And there, standing in the doorway, was another figure. It was him. Or rather, it looked like him. Henry's doppelganger stood, smiling cruelly, eyes glowing with the same unnatural light as the creature that had attacked him. "You think you can escape me," the figure said, its voice a distorted version of his own. And in that moment, Henry understood. The real horror wasn't the creature. It was the fact that whatever this place was, it wasn't just a prison, it was a game. A game that had just begun. And now, Henry was its latest player. Henry's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the twisted version of himself standing in the doorway. The grotesque smile on his doppelganger's face sent a surge of terror through his chest. His own reflection, only more sinister, more malevolent, stood there, blocking his only escape route. "You can't outrun me," the figure whispered, its voice eerily similar to Henry's, but it was laced with malice, something that sent a chill straight to his bones. You are me. And I am you. Henry staggered backward, eyes wide in disbelief. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him again. His mind scrambled, trying to make sense of this impossible situation, but everything felt like a fever dream. How was it possible? How could there be two of him? The air around him felt suffocating, too thick, too wrong. Do you remember how you got here? The figure asked, its voice now mocking, cruel. You chose this. You walked into the darkness. And now, it's time to play. The figure stepped forward, its movement smooth, too perfect, too controlled. Henry felt his body stiffen as the shadow of his own self loomed closer. The room felt smaller, colder, suffocating. The doppelganger's eyes glowed brighter, more intense, until they burned with an almost otherworldly fire. Where am I? What do you want from me? Henry's voice cracked with fear as he stumbled back, his hands scraping along the walls for any kind of escape. But the walls were slick with moisture, like they were breathing along with him. You're in my world now, the figure said, stepping even closer, its smile widening. You entered the forest, didn't you? You never should have gone there. Now, you're mine. And I'll make sure you never leave. You'll always be with me. Forever. The words hit Henry like a punch to the stomach, and for a moment, he could barely breathe. His mind raced, thinking of the night in the forest, the shadows that seemed to follow him, the eerie whispers in the trees, the sensation of being watched. But it wasn't the forest that had trapped him. It was himself. This place, this nightmare, wasn't just some random horror, it was a mirror. A reflection of his own fears, his regrets, and something darker still that he couldn't quite grasp. He had never truly escaped the forest. It had followed him, and now, it had him trapped in a labyrinth of his own making. You. You're not real, Henry muttered, more to himself than to the doppelganger, though the words felt hollow in his throat. He wanted to believe it wasn't real. He wanted to run, to escape this twisted game, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure chuckled softly, the sound slithering around him like snakes. No, I'm real. And so are you. You can't run from what you are. You can't run from me. The room seemed to shift, the walls warping and bending as if the very space around him was alive and hungry. The lights flickered above, casting elongated shadows that seemed to twist and crawl like living things. Henry stumbled forward, desperate to break free, but the room kept changing, shifting into new, more distorted shapes. And then, he heard it. That noise. The sound of dragging footsteps. He spun around, his heart sinking as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just the figure anymore. There were others. Out of the corner of his eye, Henry saw them, figures in the shadows, moving just out of his line of sight. Their bodies were contorted, twisted, grotesque, as though they were constructed from nothing but broken bones and shredded skin. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. They were everywhere, coming closer, closing in on him from all sides. The shadows flickered, their figures becoming more defined, more real with every passing second. Henry's breath came in shallow gasps as he realized that these were no longer mere phantoms of his imagination. These creatures were real. They were in this place, and they were hunting him. Who are they? Henry choked out, his voice trembling with fear. The doppelganger smiled even wider, its eyes gleaming with dark amusement. These are the others, the forgotten. The ones who tried to escape, just like you. But they couldn't. They failed. And now, they're part of this place. They'll never leave. Neither will you. Henry's blood ran cold as the figures shuffled forward, their eyes burning with malice. He knew then that this was not just a game, it was a trap. A prison. And he was the latest soul to be caught in it. He stumbled back, his mind racing as he looked for any means of escape. His eyes flicked to the door that still hadn't opened, still hadn't budged. And then he saw it, the window. It was small, just big enough for him to crawl through if he could reach it. His hope flared, and without thinking, he sprinted toward it. But as soon as he moved, the figures moved too. They were faster, more agile than he had ever expected. One of them lunged toward him, its long, skeletal fingers reaching for his throat. Henry ducked just in time, the creature's fingers grazing his skin, sending a wave of ice through his body. He scrambled for the window, his heart racing, but just as he reached it, another figure appeared, blocking his escape. The room was closing in, the figures closing in, and there was nowhere to run. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You can't escape, Henry," the doppelganger taunted. "You're already here. You've always been here. We're all here now." Henry's chest heaved with panic as he turned to face the figure. "Please," he pleaded. "I don't belong here. I just want to leave." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that reverberated around him. "You never belonged anywhere, Henry. You were always a part of this. Always." Suddenly, the room went dark. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The silence was suffocating. It felt as though the world had been swallowed by darkness, an all-consuming blackness that stretched into infinity. And then, out of the blackness, came the whisper again. "We're waiting." Henry's heart pounded in his chest as the figures began to circle around him, their movements slow, deliberate. He could hear their breath now, guttural, ragged. It was all too much, too overwhelming. The walls closed in, the darkness thickened, and all Henry could do was stand there, paralyzed by the terror that gripped him. He wasn't going to escape. He wasn't going to survive. And then, everything went quiet. Henry didn't know how long he stood there, waiting for the inevitable. He was surrounded, trapped in this nightmare with no hope of salvation. The last thing he heard was the soft whisper again, as it slithered into his mind, like the final words of a dying man. "Welcome home, Henry." The silence was suffocating. For what felt like an eternity, Henry stood frozen in the center of the room, his mind unable to process what had just happened. The whisper, the dark voice, lingered in his ears like a poisoned memory. "Welcome home, Henry." His body trembled, but he couldn't move. He didn't dare move. The air had become thick and suffocating, the shadows creeping closer, swallowing every inch of light. The figures that had surrounded him were no longer visible, but Henry could feel them, waiting, their presence hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Was he truly alone now? Or were they still there, watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike? A soft creak, barely audible, broke the oppressive stillness. It came from somewhere behind him. The sound of wood under pressure, like the slow opening of an old door. Henry's breath hitched in his throat as his heart skipped a beat. He didn't dare turn around. His feet were glued to the floor, his legs like stone. The world felt as though it was closing in around him, the walls drawing nearer with every breath he took. The creak came again, louder this time. And then a voice. "Henry, you can't hide from what's coming." It was the doppelganger. The same voice, the same chilling whisper, but it sounded different now. It wasn't taunting. It was urgent. Henry felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He could feel the cold sweat running down his spine. There was no way to know where the voice was coming from. It seemed to echo from all directions. The figures were still out there, hidden in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. "Henry," the voice repeated, closer now, just behind him. "You can't escape this place. There's no escape." His pulse thundered in his ears. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to move, to run, to do anything, but his legs refused to obey. It was as if the darkness itself had paralyzed him. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You chose this, Henry. You walked into the forest. You walked into my world. You wanted answers, but you'll never get them. You'll never leave. And you'll never forget. The whisper was like a knife to his soul, cutting through the fragile walls of his sanity. Every word felt like it was sinking into him, poisoning him from the inside out. But then, just as quickly, the voice stopped. The silence returned. Henry's breathing became ragged as he tried to gather his thoughts, trying to figure out what to do next. What was happening? What had he gotten himself into? His mind raced in circles, but nothing made sense. The more he tried to think, the more the walls seemed to close in around him, suffocating him, until all he could focus on was the deep, oppressive weight of the darkness. And then, out of the silence, came a sound. A soft, slow tap. 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 Henry's body went rigid as the sound echoed in the room, growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from somewhere nearby. Somewhere close. His instincts screamed at him to look, to run, but his mind refused to let him move. He was paralyzed by fear. The tapping continued, growing closer with every beat. Tap. 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 It was like the sound of a finger, drumming against a surface. The noise was maddening, echoing in the confines of the room. Tap. 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 And then, suddenly, it stopped. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the sudden stillness was more unnerving than the noise itself. It felt like the calm before the storm. The darkness felt even more suffocating now, more oppressive. But before he could react, a shadow darted across his vision. A figure. It was quick, too quick for him to catch a clear glimpse, but he saw enough to know it wasn't human. It was a distortion in the air, a twisting mass of darkness that seemed to shift and warp like liquid shadows. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he finally forced his legs to move. He spun around to face the figure, but it was gone. Vanished. Disappeared into the dark. Henry was shaking now, the adrenaline coursing through him. He didn't know what he was afraid of more, the dark, or what might be lurking within it. He felt like something was closing in on him from all sides. A creak from the corner of the room. Another tap. 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 His eyes snapped to the corner, heart hammering in his chest. This time, he saw it. Just a glimpse, something standing there. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it seemed to move with a jerking, uneven motion, as though its limbs were not meant to bend that way. The shadows around it twisted in unnatural shapes, dancing and swirling. No. Henry breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The figure seemed to sense his presence, its head snapping toward him, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. And then, it moved. Not forward, but sideways, sliding along the walls as if it was part of them. It was wrong. So wrong. Tap. 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 The sound was coming from all around him now. Henry's breath hitched. There were more. More figures, creeping from the shadows. The walls, the ceiling, the very air, everything was alive with motion. The doppelganger's voice echoed again, louder now, as if it was coming from inside his head. You can't fight what's already inside of you, Henry. You can't fight us. The figures closed in, surrounding him. He could see them clearly now, grotesque, contorted versions of people. Faces twisted in pain, their eyes glowing with that same eerie light. Their fingers were elongated, and their mouths hung open in grotesque, soundless screams. Henry wanted to scream. To run. But he couldn't. His body refused to move, his feet frozen to the spot. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his skull. And then, as if on cue, the figures all moved in unison. They stepped forward, their shadows stretching across the room, their grotesque faces shifting and twisting with every step. The air seemed to grow heavier with every movement, suffocating him. Henry's mind was racing now, thoughts crashing into each other, trying to figure out what to do. He had to fight. He had to escape. But how? The figures reached for him, their hands outstretched, their fingers sharp like claws. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps as they closed in on him. And then, just as their fingers were about to touch him, the room went completely still. No sound. No movement. Henry stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. It felt like time had stopped. The figures were still there, but they were no longer moving. They were waiting. Waiting for something. And then he heard it. A slow, sinister whisper, almost like a breath. "You're already too late, Henry." The darkness around him deepened. And the last thing he saw before everything went black was the twisted, malevolent grin of his doppelganger. The blackness was suffocating. It swallowed Henry whole, dragging him into an abyss where time and space no longer existed. His senses were lost in the darkness, his mind spiraling into madness. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His body felt weightless, as if suspended in nothingness. Was he dead? Was this what it felt like to die? His pulse raced in his ears, but there was no sound in the void. No breath, no heartbeat, only the creeping, gnawing sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. And then, a whisper. It started as a mere murmur, faint like the wind rustling through leaves. But the more he listened, the louder it grew, until it became a deafening scream, echoing in his skull. "You never should have come." Henry snapped his eyes open. He was back. Back in the abandoned house, standing in the same room. The same room that had been consumed by darkness, where the figures had surrounded him. The same room where he had heard the voice that had taunted him, that had promised him death. But everything was different now. The room was no longer empty. The shadows had grown, no, they had shifted. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, breathing in and out with each passing second. The floor beneath him creaked with the weight of something large, something monstrous. And the figures, those twisted, grotesque versions of people, were still there, their eyes glowing with the same sickly yellow light, but now there were more of them. Dozens. Hundreds. They filled every inch of the room, their forms flickering in and out of the shadows, like ghosts trapped in an eternal nightmare. Henry tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. His throat was dry, tight with fear. He was paralyzed. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. He was trapped, surrounded by these creatures, these horrors. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to break, the ground beneath him shook. A low, guttural growl echoed from the floorboards, vibrating through his body, rattling his bones. The walls cracked, the ceiling groaned, and something massive, something ancient, began to rise from the very earth itself. A creature. A thing. A monstrosity. It was massive, towering above him, its shape shifting like smoke, its body made of writhing shadows and flesh. Its eyes were like burning coals, glowing with an unholy light. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, each one longer than a knife, dripping with something dark and viscous. Henry's heart skipped a beat. His chest tightened as the creature let out a horrific, blood-curdling roar. It was a sound that felt like it was tearing through his very soul. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He couldn't run. And then, the creature moved. It lunged at him with lightning speed, its massive jaws snapping shut with a deafening crack. Henry barely managed to throw himself to the side, but he wasn't fast enough. The air around him seemed to freeze as the creature's teeth grazed his arm, cutting through flesh like butter. Pain exploded in his body, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming terror that washed over him. His mind was racing, he couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. No one to help. The creature was everywhere. The figures were everywhere. They were all closing in. And then he heard it again, the whisper. The same voice that had tormented him since the beginning. "You cannot escape, Henry. You belong to us. The words seemed to echo in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like chains, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. He was trapped. There was no escape. No way out. The room seemed to close in on him. The figures reached for him, their hands clawing at his skin. The creature loomed over him, its breath hot and fetid against his neck. Henry's legs buckled beneath him as he fell to the ground, his body unable to keep up with the overwhelming terror that had overtaken him. The creature's jaws hovered above him, ready to strike. And then, in that final, heart-stopping moment, Henry understood. He wasn't going to survive this. The creatures, the voices, the shadows, they were all part of something bigger. Something that had been waiting for him. Waiting for the moment when he would finally realize the truth. He wasn't meant to escape. He wasn't meant to survive. This was his fate. And just as the creature's jaws snapped shut, the world went black. The story concludes with the final breath taken, leaving only silence in the haunted house. The creatures, the whispers, and the terror linger, forever part of a forgotten nightmare that never truly ends. The moment Jake cracked the code, his screen went black. Then, a single message appeared on his phone from an unknown number. I see you've unlocked it. Now, you belong to us. Jake laughed it off at first, thinking it was just some prank. But when strange things began happening around him, his computer turning on and off by itself, files mysteriously disappearing, and whispers echoing from his speakers, he realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't just dealing with a hacker's challenge. He had opened the door to something far darker. What had he unleashed, and who was watching him? Would he survive to undo his mistake, or had he just sealed his fate? Jake had always been the quiet one. The kid who sat in the back of the class, the one whose face was hidden behind the glow of a computer screen. He was a genius, no doubt about it, an undiscovered talent when it came to hacking. His reputation in the online hacker community was growing, though he didn't care much for the fame. He didn't need the recognition. The thrill of cracking codes, bypassing firewalls, and accessing systems was all the reward he ever needed. It was just another normal evening when Jake came across the forum post. It wasn't anything special, just another challenge, another encrypted file for him to break. But something about the title caught his eye, the silent code. Unlock the truth. Prize beyond your imagination. Curiosity piqued, Jake clicked on the post. There was no description, just a link to an encrypted file, its password locked tight. The rules were simple: break the encryption, find the prize. No details about what the prize might be, just a cryptic promise. He didn't hesitate. Jake downloaded the file without a second thought. The file's size was unusually large, and its structure was complex. It wasn't like the usual hacks or cracks he'd worked on. This was different. There was something about it that sent a chill down his spine, but he brushed it off. It was probably just an overreaction. Sitting in his dimly lit room, Jake began typing furiously, using every tool in his arsenal. Each line of code he deciphered led him further into the depths of the file. It was almost like a puzzle designed specifically for him, perfectly tailored to his skills. It made no sense at first, but the thrill of discovery kept him going. Hours passed without him noticing. His eyes were burning from the screen, but he didn't care. And then, it happened. The last encryption fell. The file was open. For a brief moment, the screen flickered, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. A simple text box appeared, asking only one question. Do you want to know the truth? Jake's fingers froze above the keyboard. His mind raced. What truth? The thrill of the challenge, the excitement of unlocking something no one else could, had blinded him to the potential dangers. He should have walked away. But his curiosity, his hunger for discovery, overpowered any lingering doubt. He typed yes. The screen went black. Panic set in. Jake's fingers flew across the keyboard, desperately trying to revive the screen, but nothing happened. The computer remained dark. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned the power off and on again. Nothing. It was like the machine had completely shut down. His breath quickened, and the room suddenly felt colder. That was when he noticed it. A strange hum coming from his speakers. He leaned in closer, trying to make sense of it. The sound was faint, almost inaudible, like a whisper carried on the wind. He pulled out the power cord, but the humming didn't stop. The screen stayed black, but the speakers crackled with static. And then, in the stillness of the room, he heard a voice. A voice he didn't recognize. It was distorted, barely audible, but chillingly clear. "I see you found the code." Jake's breath hitched. His body went rigid. He scrambled to unplug the speakers, but the words continued, growing louder, more distinct. "You're not alone anymore, Jake." Suddenly, his phone buzzed. His heart nearly stopped. A text message from an unknown number. He didn't even need to open it. He already knew what it would say. "I see you've unlocked it." The blood drained from Jake's face. His palms were sweaty. Something was wrong. This was no ordinary hack. This wasn't a game. Jake's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. But it was too late. The code, the file, the truth, it had already marked him. The whispering in the speakers continued, growing louder with each passing second. And then, everything went dead silent. Jake's phone buzzed again. The message that appeared on the screen sent a chill down his spine. "You're next." The room felt suffocating now. The air thick, as though something was pressing in from all sides. His skin prickled with fear. There was no way out now. What had he just unlocked? And who, or what, was watching him? Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the screen, the text message flashing in front of him, "You're next." It was as if the words had burned their way into his mind, searing through his thoughts with an intensity he couldn't shake. He tried to push it away, to tell himself it was just a prank, some twisted joke, but deep down, he knew it was something much worse. His computer remained unresponsive, its black screen mocking him. His room, once a haven of solitude, now felt oppressive, as though something unseen was lurking, waiting, watching. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the speakers, still crackling with faint whispers, but they were now strangely silent. The room was suffocatingly quiet. His phone buzzed again, pulling his attention away from the dark screen. Jake's fingers shook as he unlocked it. Another message from the unknown number. His throat tightened as he read the text. "You should have stopped before you clicked yes. Now, you belong to us." A cold sweat dripped down Jake's back. The words sent a wave of nausea through him. He wanted to throw his phone across the room, but his body refused to move. It was as if his very soul was tethered to the device, unable to break free. He tried to block the number, to ignore the messages, but when he went to do so, the screen flickered, and the same message popped up again. "Now, you belong to us." His mind raced. What had he gotten himself into? Who were they? He had to know more. But every instinct in him screamed to shut everything down, to walk away from the computer, and never look back. But he couldn't. The allure of the unknown, the fear of what came next, trapped him. His curiosity had led him to this point, and it was now pulling him deeper. Without thinking, Jake picked up his laptop and opened it. The screen blinked to life, but the only thing that appeared was a series of flashing symbols, random, chaotic, and incomprehensible. He tried to close it, but the symbols remained, swirling on the screen like an endless vortex. Then, for the first time, a new message appeared. "We know what you did." His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was the message or the cold that seemed to settle over him, but he could feel his heart racing as panic crept in. Was this some kind of hacker group messing with him? But these messages, the way the system was glitching, the strange whispers, it felt far too personal, far too sinister to be a simple prank. Suddenly, the whispers from the speakers returned, louder this time, as though they were no longer coming from the speakers, but from every corner of the room. A low, guttural sound. Something barely human. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the air thickening with the oppressive force of something malevolent. Jake's eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more menacing. His vision blurred, and for a split second, the room felt wrong, warped, twisted, like something had shifted, just slightly. He blinked and shook his head. No, it was just his imagination. Then, a soft tapping noise echoed from behind him. At first, Jake thought it was the sound of his own heartbeat. But it grew louder, closer, tap, 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 coming from the direction of the window. He froze. He hadn't heard it before. It was the sound of something, or someone, outside, trying to get in. Jake slowly turned around, his heart thumping in his chest. The window was shut tight, the blinds drawn. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew more insistent, louder. Tap, 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 until it sounded like frantic knocking. He stood frozen in place, eyes fixed on the window. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to listen. A strange, unexplainable force had taken hold of him, rooting him in place as the tapping continued. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. Jake let out a shaky breath. His hand gripped the edge of his desk as he tried to steady himself. He took a step forward, toward the window, but as he did, a sudden noise came from his phone. It buzzed, vibrating violently in his hand. His thumb hovered over the screen, terrified to look at it, but at the same time, unable to resist. He unlocked the phone, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked at the message. "Don't look outside." Jake's blood ran cold. He had already taken a step closer to the window, and now he couldn't move. Something was out there. Something was waiting. He could feel it, something in the darkness, something far worse than any hacker or prankster. He had broken a rule, opened a door that should have stayed locked. The tapping started again, louder this time, more frantic, as though something was trying to break through. A shadow moved across the window, a shape, human. No. It was something far worse. Jake's heart raced as he backed away from the window, but then, as if in slow motion, the blinds were ripped open from the outside. The room grew darker. He didn't see anyone, didn't hear a thing, but the cold, suffocating presence crept closer. He stumbled backward, falling to the floor, his body shaking with fear. And that was when he heard the voice again, this time, not from the speakers, not from the phone, but from inside his own mind. A voice so cold, so familiar, it made him want to scream. "You've unlocked the door. Now, you have to let us in." Jake's vision blurred, and everything went dark. The last thing he heard before he blacked out was the sound of the tapping on his window, this time, from the inside. Jake woke up to complete silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and leaves you feeling disoriented. His body was sprawled across the floor, his muscles stiff, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The chill in the room sent a shiver down his spine. His head ached like someone had cracked it open with a sledgehammer, but there was something far worse than the pain, an unsettling emptiness in the air, a presence that wasn't there before. His eyes flickered open, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long, grotesque shadows across the room. Jake tried to sit up but found himself immobilized. His body felt heavy, like something was holding him down. He blinked several times, trying to clear his vision, but the room felt wrong. His surroundings were the same, but it was as if everything had been twisted, distorted. There, on his desk, was his laptop, open, screen glowing with an eerie green hue. His heart pounded in his chest. How long had he been out? His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The tapping, the shadows, the voice, had it all been a dream? No. The feeling in his gut told him it was all too real. The things he had seen, the things he had heard, they were out there. Watching. Jake forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. He stumbled toward the desk, drawn to the laptop like a moth to a flame. As his fingers hovered over the keyboard, his eyes lingered on the reflection in the darkened screen. That's when he saw it. A shadow, no, not a shadow. It was a figure, barely visible in the dark, but unmistakably human. His breath hitched in his throat, and he recoiled, slamming his hands down on the desk, knocking the laptop off the edge. The screen went black with a dull thud, and Jake stumbled backward, his pulse racing. But something inside him, some dark force that had taken root, told him to look again. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He needed to understand what had just happened, what that thing was in the reflection. Jake cautiously knelt beside the laptop, the dim glow from his desk lamp the only light in the room. His trembling hands picked up the device and powered it on. The screen flickered to life, and his eyes widened in horror. There was something in the reflection. The figure from before, it was still there. But it wasn't a mere shadow. It was a distorted version of himself. He froze. The figure in the reflection was standing in the same position as him, but it was different. It was as if the reflection had its own life, a twisted, malformed version of Jake. The figure's eyes were dark and hollow, like black voids, and its smile was stretched wide across its face, too wide. Too unnatural. It was almost like it was mocking him, watching him with an expression of pure malice. Jake blinked, trying to force the image out of his mind, but it was still there. He looked away, his breath shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. The reflection didn't move. But he could feel it staring back at him. Then, the voice returned. It was not from the speakers or his phone this time, but from the darkness itself, from the reflection. Do you see us now? Jake's breath caught in his throat. The voice sounded like his own, but colder, empty. The reflection of himself was speaking to him, but it wasn't him. It couldn't be. His body shook with fear. The more he looked, the more he realized that this was no hallucination. This was real. The figure on the screen wasn't just a reflection, it was something else. Something trying to get out. His fingers, against his will, reached forward, touching the screen. The moment his fingers brushed against the glass, a jolt of electricity surged through him, sending a sharp pain through his fingertips. He yanked his hand back with a gasp, but the screen didn't flicker. The figure didn't move. But then, as if to prove that it could, the reflection's smile grew wider. Its eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The figure lifted its hand in a slow, deliberate motion, mirroring Jake's own. And then, it did something that made Jake's blood run cold. It touched the screen. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The figure was mimicking him, mocking him. Its fingers, black and twisted, slid slowly across the glass, tracing the same path Jake had just taken. Jake's breath quickened, a feeling of panic rising in his chest. He needed to stop this. He needed to break the connection. He tried to slam the laptop shut, but it wouldn't budge. His hands were shaking too violently, and the screen seemed to grow colder, darker, more oppressive with every second. Then the reflection in the screen did something terrifying. It winked. A slow, mocking wink. Jake felt his stomach churn as dread crawled up his spine. He stumbled back from the desk, but no matter how far he moved, he couldn't escape the feeling that the reflection was there with him, inside the room. Watching. Waiting. You're not alone, Jake. The voice was clear now, unmistakable. It came from inside his own head, whispering in his ear, making his thoughts feel alien. He slammed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. The reflection on the screen laughed. It was the same laugh he had heard earlier, the low, guttural sound that made his skin crawl. It echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of his skull. He could no longer tell where the reflection ended and where his own mind began. It was as if the boundaries between them had dissolved. Jake backed away further, but his feet stumbled on the floor, and he fell, crashing into his chair. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. The reflection stared back at him, its black, hollow eyes gleaming with malevolent satisfaction. It was no longer just a reflection, it was something else entirely. Jake's body went cold as the realization hit him. The reflection wasn't just watching him. It was controlling him. And that voice, it wasn't just in his mind. It was all around him. It was in the shadows. It was in the cold air that now filled the room. It was everywhere. You thought you could escape, didn't you? Jake's heart stopped. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness that now surrounded him. The room was closing in. And in that moment, Jake understood. The reflection wasn't just something he saw. It was a part of him. A part of him that he could never escape. The laptop screen flickered, and the last thing Jake saw before everything went black was the reflection, its twisted smile stretching wider and wider, until it consumed everything. Jake didn't know how long he'd been lying there, his body cold and stiff, his mind suspended between terror and confusion. The room was silent, so silent that he could hear the sound of his own pulse in his ears, each beat hammering louder and faster. He wanted to scream, to wake up from this nightmare, but his throat was dry, his voice lost to the emptiness that surrounded him. The darkness had swallowed the room, yet the laptop's glowing screen still lingered, an eerie green light cutting through the shadows like a toxic flame. The reflection, the thing that wasn't him, stared back at him from the screen, its black eyes empty yet full of malicious intent. The whispering voice returned, louder this time, echoing inside his skull. "You're not alone, Jake." Jake clenched his fists, desperate to drown out the voice, but it only grew louder, swirling around him like a storm in his mind. His head spun, and his vision blurred. His body trembled with a mixture of fear and rage, but it was no use. He couldn't escape it. What was happening? He blinked, trying to focus on something, anything, but the figure in the reflection just kept staring back at him. The more he stared at it, the more it felt like it was pulling him in, like its hollow eyes were sucking the very life out of him. A chill ran through his spine, and suddenly, the air in the room felt heavier. A cold gust of wind swept through the space, though the windows were closed. The hairs on his neck stood up. He could feel something shifting, moving in the darkness, but when he turned around, there was nothing. Just empty space. And yet, he could feel it. The reflection on the laptop screen twitched, the figure moving ever so slightly. Jake leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. He watched in horror as the figure began to smile, an unnatural, grotesque grin stretching too wide for any human to possibly manage. The reflection's mouth opened, and Jake's stomach turned as the figure spoke, its voice unmistakably his own, but distorted, twisted. "You can't run, Jake. We're inside you now." Jake's body went rigid, and for the first time, he could feel the ground beneath him shifting, warping. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something unseen. The walls seemed to close in around him, but it wasn't just the physical space. No, it was something deeper. Something in his very thoughts. Something that was moving within him, filling the cracks in his mind. Had the reflection always been him? The voice inside his head spoke again, but this time, it was different. It was no longer just a whisper. It was clear, louder than his own thoughts. More demanding. "You think you're in control. But you never were." Jake's pulse quickened as his vision started to swim. The air felt like it was growing thicker, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He stumbled backward, his hands grasping at the walls for support, but it felt like the walls themselves were shifting beneath his touch. In a frenzy, he grabbed the laptop, desperate to end it, to shut it down, to make the reflection disappear. But when he flipped the screen shut, the sound of the hinge was too sharp, too unnatural. It felt wrong. As if the laptop was resisting. He threw it across the room, and it crashed into the wall with a loud bang. But it didn't stop there. The laptop, now lying broken on the floor, began to tremble. The screen cracked, spiderwebbing across the glass, but the reflection was still there, staring back at him. Jake backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. No. No, this can't be real. It's just a glitch. It's just. The screen flickered, the cracks in the glass expanding, and then, the reflection stepped out. It happened so fast that Jake couldn't even comprehend it. 1 second, the reflection was just a distorted image on the broken screen. The next, the figure, his twisted, deformed double, was standing right in front of him. The room spun, the walls distorting as if they were breathing, and Jake's body froze in terror. His own reflection stood in front of him, mirroring his every move, but with a wicked, twisted grin on its face. Its eyes were black voids, hollow and unblinking. The same eyes Jake saw every time he looked at the screen. But now, they were here. With him. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure, his reflection, stepped closer, its breath cold against his skin. Jake's legs were shaking, his entire body trembling with fear. "It's not just the screen, Jake," the reflection whispered, its voice echoing in his ears. "You wanted to know what it feels like to be truly free. To be rid of all the limitations. Well, now you're mine." The reflection's hand reached out and touched Jake's chest, a cold shock running through his body. His eyes widened as the world around him began to distort further. The walls closed in. The room shrank. The laptop screen shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the reflection remained, hanging in the air like a dark mist, twisting and warping. Jake gasped for air, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped. The figure, himself, had taken over. There was no escape. "You were never the hacker, Jake." The reflection's voice was now all around him, all-encompassing, suffocating. "You were the experiment." In that moment, Jake understood. Everything that had happened, every twisted thing he'd seen, every thought that had crossed his mind, this wasn't just some hack. It was a game. A game where he was the prey. And his reflection? It was the hunter. And it wasn't done yet. The figure leaned in closer, its twisted face inches from Jake's, the foul stench of decay filling the air. "Welcome to the end, Jake." With a sickening laugh, the reflection opened its mouth wide, its jaw dislocating, stretching too far to be human. It lunged toward him, its teeth sharp as daggers, its hollow eyes gleaming with hunger. And then, the world went black. The night had descended with an oppressive heaviness, the air thick with an eerie silence that seemed to swallow every sound. Henry's mind raced, replaying the events from the past few days. No matter how many times he tried to make sense of it, there was always something missing. Something he couldn't quite grasp. The clock on the wall ticked, louder than usual, as though mocking him. The dim light in his room flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced and stretched across the walls. Henry stared at the computer screen, eyes wide, as though willing it to offer an explanation. But all it showed was a black screen, and the eerie words, "You're not alone." His heart skipped a beat. How was this possible? His hacking skills had given him access to everything, yet this felt different. This wasn't some run-of-the-mill virus or prank, it was personal. The feeling of eyes watching him intensified, and Henry spun around, half expecting someone, or something, to be lurking behind him. Nothing. Just the quiet of his room. But the unsettling feeling lingered. He clicked on his phone, eager to check for any messages. No new notifications. His thoughts began to spiral. Who was behind this? Why him? And what did they want? Then, without warning, the lights in his room went out. The cold, the oppressive silence, everything felt too still, too perfect. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he fumbled for his flashlight, but just as his fingers brushed the edge of it, the door to his room creaked open. His heart pounded. It was impossible. He had locked that door himself. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned, holding his breath, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Not a sound. Was it just his mind playing tricks on him? Was he losing his grip on reality, like his parents had suggested? Or was something, or someone, really in the house? Then came a voice. A whisper, so soft that it might have been his imagination. "Henry, it's too late." He froze. His entire body went rigid, as if he had been paralyzed. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. His blood ran cold as the voice seemed to crawl into his ears, slithering under his skin. Without thinking, he grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the door. Nothing. No one. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But the only answer he received was a cold draft that blew through the room, sending a shiver down his spine. It was as if the very air around him had changed, becoming thicker, heavier. A sudden loud bang echoed through the house, and Henry nearly jumped out of his skin. It sounded like it had come from downstairs, but he couldn't move. His legs were frozen in place, his mind screaming at him to do something, to run. But he couldn't. The seconds felt like hours as he slowly forced himself to step toward the door, hand trembling as he gripped the handle. With a burst of adrenaline, he flung the door open and rushed into the hallway. But as he looked down toward the stairs, the darkness seemed to stretch out in front of him, as if it was waiting for him to take the first step. The house felt different now, alive in a way it never had before. Was it his mind playing tricks, or had something truly sinister taken hold of the house? Without thinking, he bolted for the stairs, hoping that the light from his phone would be enough to cut through the darkness. His steps echoed loudly in the empty house, each footstep sending waves of dread through him. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he froze. There, standing in the center of the living room, was a figure. A silhouette, so still, so unnervingly calm. Henry's breath caught in his throat as his flashlight flickered, its light growing weaker by the second. "Who are you?" Henry called out, his voice hoarse. The figure didn't answer. It didn't even move. It just stood there, its presence more suffocating than the dark around him. Suddenly, the light on his phone blinked out entirely, plunging him back into total darkness. And then came the voice again. Closer this time. "Henry, you've made a mistake. You've let it in." It was too much to bear. His heart raced as he spun around, the darkness closing in around him. He reached for the door, his fingers grazing the handle. And that's when it happened. A pair of icy fingers wrapped around his wrist. A cold so intense, so unnatural, that he screamed. The grip tightened, pulling him into the shadows, dragging him back into the darkness of the house. He couldn't see it. He couldn't understand it. But he could feel it, something was coming for him, and it wasn't human. Bang! The door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in, and just like that, everything went silent. The only thing left was the faint hum of the computer, still on, still showing that same message, "You're not alone." The silence was unbearable. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the terror slowly tightening around him. His hands trembled as he fumbled with his phone, the dim glow of the screen barely offering any comfort in the suffocating darkness. He couldn't hear a thing. Not even his breath seemed to dare make a sound. Every part of him screamed for action, but his legs were frozen, as though the shadows themselves had wrapped around him and refused to let go. He stood there, in the middle of the dark, empty room, his mind racing in every direction, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it didn't make sense. None of it did. The figure, the one standing in the living room, unmoving, as though it had always been there, was gone. But Henry could still feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing against his chest. A sound broke the silence, just a whisper, barely audible. "Henry." It came from somewhere behind him. His heart leaped into his throat as he spun around, flashlight raised. But there was nothing. The room was empty, the walls closing in on him, the darkness thicker than ever. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the fear, it was real. The sweat on his skin, the cold creeping in from all directions, the gut-wrenching feeling that he was being watched, it was all real. He tried to move, but his feet wouldn't obey. It was as though something was holding him in place, preventing him from escaping. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice weak, trembling. No answer. But the temperature in the room had dropped. The chill was unbearable now, freezing him to the core. He could see his breath in the air, thick and white. The cold wasn't just the weather anymore, it was coming from within the house, as if the very walls themselves had become vessels for something much darker. And then, just as suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the house. The sound reverberated through the walls, as though the house itself had shuddered in pain. Henry's pulse quickened. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't. Without thinking, he rushed toward the door, fingers numb as he grasped the handle. But just as he pulled, the door wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, panic bubbling up in his chest, but the door stayed shut, as if some invisible force was keeping him inside. His breathing grew frantic, chest heaving with each breath. A cold laugh echoed from the shadows. It wasn't a human laugh, it was wrong, twisted, hollow. Henry's blood ran cold. The laugh grew louder, closer, until it was right behind him. "Leave now," the voice whispered, low and menacing. Henry turned around, flashlight shaking in his hand, but there was no one there. Just darkness. And the suffocating feeling of something closing in on him. Bang! The sound came again, this time from the far end of the hallway. Henry's eyes snapped to the source, but he saw nothing. Yet, there it was. A shadow. Thin, creeping, like something moving in the corner of his vision, just out of reach. It was shifting and sliding along the walls, growing darker, stretching impossibly long. Henry couldn't look away. His body screamed at him to run, to move, to do anything, but he stood there, paralyzed by the sight. Another bang, and this time the shadow seemed to grow more solid, like it was taking shape. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something else. Something, alive. "Help me," the voice croaked from the darkness, thin and desperate. Henry's body went cold with realization. The voice was familiar. It was him. It was his own voice, echoing from the darkness, pleading for help. But how could it be? He hadn't spoken a word since that first whisper. The flashlight flickered violently before going out completely, leaving him in absolute blackness. He was blind now, completely unable to see anything in front of him, behind him, or around him. Only the sounds remained. The whispers. The laughter. The banging. And then, a cold hand, icy, almost painfully so, touched his shoulder. His breath hitched in his throat. He didn't dare move. He couldn't move. The hand was like a vice, holding him in place. Slowly, impossibly slow, he turned his head, the chill in the air freezing his very soul. But there was nothing. No figure. No creature. Just the feeling of something, something unseen, standing right beside him. "Get out," the voice hissed again. It was so close now. In his ear. With his heart hammering, Henry stumbled backward, hands reaching out in the darkness, desperate to find something, anything to anchor him in reality. But it was no use. He felt the floor drop beneath him as if the house itself was consuming him, pulling him down into an abyss. Suddenly, the door to the outside, the one he had tried to open earlier, burst open with a deafening crash. The force of it sent Henry flying backward, and for a moment, he thought he saw light, real light, coming through the doorway. It was his only chance. Without thinking, he rushed toward the door, pushing past the threshold into the cold night. But as he stepped outside, he froze. The house behind him, his home, was gone. There was nothing left but an empty, barren field. The lights from the house that should have been there, the familiar walls, the comforting shape of it, all vanished. And then, in the distance, he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Walking toward him in perfect, synchronized steps, their faces obscured by shadows. They were coming for him. The figures loomed closer, their steps almost mechanical in the distance. Henry's pulse thundered in his ears as he stood frozen on the empty field. His legs refused to move, every ounce of his being consumed by a bone-deep fear that gripped him like a vice. They were coming, and there was nowhere to run. No way to escape. His eyes darted around, trying to find any sign of the world he once knew, but it was all gone. The house, his home, had vanished. In its place, the dark expanse of the field stretched endlessly, with no boundaries, no safety, only the slowly advancing figures. He looked back at the door he had just escaped from. It now stood ajar, the dark threshold staring at him like an invitation, or a trap. He couldn't decide. As the figures neared, their shapes became clearer. But the more Henry looked, the more his stomach churned in confusion and terror. They were all wearing identical clothing, long, flowing black robes that billowed as they walked. Their faces, however, were a different matter. Blank. Empty. Like masks frozen in an expressionless void. The lead figure stepped forward, its face hidden in the darkness of the hood. But Henry knew it was watching him. He could feel its gaze on him, cold and unyielding. He took a step back, his breath quickening. Who are you? His voice cracked, weak in the face of this horror. He barely recognized himself in the question, as though the terror had stolen his very identity. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it extended a hand. Slowly. Deliberately. Each movement seemed to carry the weight of an eternity. The hand was pale, almost ghostly, with fingers that were unnaturally long and thin. It hovered inches away from him, as if giving him a chance to pull away. But Henry couldn't move. A whisper came from the figure, chilling in its quiet insistence, "You are ours." And in that moment, Henry felt something inside of him snap. It was like an invisible force, pulling at his soul, dragging him toward the figure's outstretched hand. No matter how hard he tried to resist, it was as if he had no control over his own body. His feet began to move, as though they were obeying a command beyond his will. "Stop. Please." He begged, though the words felt useless in his throat. The figures closed in on him, their hollow eyes now fully visible. There were no irises, no pupils, just a vast, empty void where there should have been something human. They were like shells, like echoes of people who had long since died. He could feel their cold breath against his skin as they encircled him, closing him in tighter and tighter. The darkness seemed to press in from every side. The stars above, the only light left in the world, faded, as though they were retreating into the depths of the sky, leaving him in an abyss of nothingness. Henry's breathing grew erratic, each breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. The lead figure finally spoke, its voice like a low, gravelly hum. "Your soul is ours to claim. You've always belonged to the shadows." Henry's heart skipped a beat. "No. No." He screamed, the panic rising in him like a tidal wave. But it was too late. The figures reached out, their hands cold and firm. As they touched him, Henry felt a strange sensation, an emptiness that filled his chest, a pulling, a draining of his very essence. His vision blurred, and his limbs grew heavy, as though the weight of his body no longer belonged to him. The shadows began to swallow him whole, a deep, suffocating darkness that devoured everything in its path. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The world around him twisted and bent, folding in on itself until all that remained was the unrelenting blackness. And then, just as it seemed everything was lost, there was a sudden flash of light. A harsh, blinding light that split through the darkness like a knife. For a brief, fleeting moment, Henry could see the figures recoiling, as though the light burned them. But it was too quick, too brief. The light flickered out. And everything went silent. Henry's body went limp as the darkness took over again, but this time, he could feel something different. A shift. A change. He was no longer in the field. He was back in his home. The house he had once tried to escape. But it was different now. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, the floorboards warped. The air was thick, saturated with something foul, something that didn't belong. The silence was oppressive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, unsure of where to go, what to do. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't alone. In the distance, in the dark corner of the room, he saw the figure again. It stood still, just as it had before, its face hidden beneath the hood. It didn't move. Didn't speak. But Henry could feel it. The hunger. The emptiness. The promise that he belonged to them now. And the worst part was, he had no idea what would come next. The suspense builds up, leaving the fate of Henry unresolved. The sense of helplessness and the relentless nature of the figures creates an intense, terrifying atmosphere. What happens when you lose everything to the darkness? When you're left with nothing but the silence and the fear of what's to come? We might never know, or we might just be forced to face it. Stay safe, wherever you are. You've probably read books that send chills down your spine. But what if the book you're reading isn't just telling a story, it's pulling you into one? Meet Lucy, a quiet, book-loving girl who finds solace in the pages of her favorite horror novels. But when she picks up an old, mysterious book from a second-hand shop, something changes. The lines between fiction and reality start to blur. The characters in the book don't just stay on the pages, they start appearing in her life. What do you do when the next chapter might just be your own? Lucy had always loved books, but there was one that she couldn't shake off. It wasn't the first book she'd ever picked up, but it was the one that changed everything. The day started like any other. Lucy, a 16-year-old with a quiet demeanor and a love for literature, spent her Saturday afternoon in the local library. The musty scent of paper filled the air as she perused the aisles of worn bookshelves, her fingers brushing against the spines, scanning for something new to read. The library was her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape her thoughts and immerse herself in someone else's world. It was then that her eyes fell on something unexpected. At the back of the library, a dimly lit aisle seemed to beckon her. She hadn't noticed it before, and it felt like she shouldn't be there. The shelves in this section were older, more weathered, and the books were stacked haphazardly, as if no one had bothered to maintain them for years. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. That's when she saw it, a book, hidden behind a pile of dusty novels. Its cover was faded, almost as if it had been untouched for decades. The title was in bold letters, The Whispers in the Dark. She could barely make out the name of the author, as it was worn down to a mere scribble. But there was something about it. Something that tugged at her. She pulled the book from the shelf, and as soon as she touched it, a strange feeling washed over her. It was almost as if the book had been waiting for her. She flipped the cover open, her fingers trembling slightly. The first page was blank, just a plain white sheet. The second page was different. The words were written in an elegant, yet old-fashioned script, but what caught her attention was the message at the top. "Lucy, we've been waiting for you." Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the words, unable to look away. No one else knew her name. No one had even said her name aloud since she'd moved to this town. The librarian was the only person who knew her by name, and Lucy hadn't seen her that day. Was this some sort of prank? She turned the page, trying to dismiss the growing sense of unease that settled in her chest. But as she read on, the words seemed to sink into her thoughts, as if they were written just for her. The story began simply. A young girl, much like herself, named Abigail, who had always felt like she didn't belong. Abigail's family had moved into a creaky old house on the edge of town, a house that was rumored to be haunted. The story was familiar to Lucy. How many ghost stories had she read about isolated houses and strange happenings? But this one felt different. It wasn't just a story. As she turned the pages, it seemed to mirror her life in eerie ways. Abigail's parents were often absent, just like Lucy's. The girl spent most of her time alone. As Lucy did, Abigail had long, dark hair, just like Lucy. It was too close for comfort. As she read further, she began to feel watched. The air in the library seemed to grow colder, and the whispers, soft at first, began to circle her. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but the whispers weren't random. They seemed to be calling her name. The voice was faint but unmistakable. Lucy. The chill in the air grew stronger, and Lucy's fingers trembled as she turned the page, her eyes glued to the text. Abigail, in the book, had begun hearing whispers too, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, calling her, pulling her deeper into the house. Abigail began to fear that the house was alive in ways that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. Lucy felt a shiver crawl down her spine, her thoughts racing. This was just a book. This wasn't real. But when she reached the next page, it was different. The ink bled across the page, as though something was pressing against it from the other side. The text was no longer neat, it was messy, frantic, like someone had scribbled it in a panic. They're here. They know you're reading. They're waiting for you. Lucy's pulse quickened. She looked around. The library was still, too still. The sound of her breath filled her ears. Was someone watching her? She snapped the book shut, her heart racing. The whispers had stopped. But the damage had been done. She couldn't shake the feeling that the story in the book wasn't just a story. Something about it felt too real. She grabbed her things and hurried out of the library, the weight of the book heavy in her bag. The sunlight outside didn't seem as warm as it had when she entered. Her footsteps echoed in the empty streets, and with every step, she felt as though someone was following her. When she reached home, she locked the door behind her. She placed the book on the kitchen counter, staring at it for a long moment. The message she had read lingered in her mind. They know you're reading. What did it mean? Was it some twisted coincidence? Was someone playing a game with her? She pushed the thoughts aside, deciding that she was just being paranoid. But as night fell, the unease returned. The whispers were back, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then they grew louder, creeping around the edges of her mind, until she heard it, clear as day. Lucy. She froze. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the book. It was coming from inside her own home. Something was in the shadows, waiting, watching. Her eyes darted around the room. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Her heart raced, her breathing shallow. She reached for the book, but it wasn't there. The counter was empty. It had vanished. She turned quickly, checking every corner of the room, but there was no sign of the book anywhere. The whispers grew louder. They weren't in the room. They were in her head. The last thing Lucy remembered before she blacked out was a voice, right next to her ear, a breath that chilled her to the bone. Lucy, you can't escape. And then, everything went black. Lucy awoke to an unsettling silence. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock, and the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees outside were all she could hear. She was lying on her bedroom floor, the cold wood beneath her a stark contrast to the sweat that clung to her skin. Her heart was racing, and her mind felt foggy, disoriented. What had happened? She sat up, brushing her damp hair from her forehead, and looked around. Her room seemed normal, almost too normal. The light from the street lamp outside filtered through her curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. The book. She had to find the book. It had to be here. She pushed herself to her feet and stumbled toward the kitchen. The moment she entered, her stomach turned. The kitchen, too, looked normal, except for one thing. The book. The Whispers in the Dark was back on the counter, its cover slightly creased, as though it had been opened and closed several times. But she had locked it away. She had placed it in the drawer next to the refrigerator before passing out. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly approached the counter. It seemed almost as if it was waiting for her. She couldn't help it, she reached out for it. The moment her fingers brushed against the cover, a sharp chill shot through her. The room grew colder, and she pulled her hand away, her heart thumping wildly. The whispers were back. Lucy. They were soft, like a breeze, but unmistakable. She spun around, but there was no one there. No one except her reflection in the refrigerator door. Her face looked pale, drawn, and her wide eyes were filled with fear. The voice was inside her head again, circling her thoughts like a predator. Was it just in her mind, or was something truly here with her? The fear was consuming, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. She had to get out of there. She had to leave before whatever this was, whatever was happening, took hold of her. But as she turned to flee, she froze. The shadows in the room weren't right. They were darker than usual, stretching unnaturally, shifting with an almost deliberate intent. The refrigerator door creaked open slowly, though Lucy was sure she hadn't touched it. A hand, a cold, pale hand, reached out from the darkness, its long fingers curling toward her. It wasn't human. Before she could react, the hand vanished. The fridge door slammed shut, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. Lucy gasped for breath, her chest tightening. The room had gone silent again, but the silence felt heavier this time, suffocating. She grabbed the book, her hands shaking as she flipped it open. The pages were blank, no words, no ink, just stark white paper. But as she stared at the pages, something began to appear. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, words began to form. Lucy, you can never leave. Her eyes widened in horror as the words continued to appear on the page, scribbling themselves in the same frantic handwriting as before. The house knows you're here. She slammed the book shut and backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. Her mind was reeling. The house? What was it talking about? What did the book mean? She needed answers. But the questions in her mind only deepened. Was it possible that her house was alive? Had it always been this way? She tried to calm herself. It was just a book. A strange, creepy book, but nothing more, right? But then she heard it again. Lucy. This time, the voice wasn't in her head. It was coming from the hallway, from the darkness just outside the kitchen. The voice was softer now, more insistent, and it called her name over and over again. She felt her body freeze, unable to move, paralyzed by fear. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to see what was there. But she had no choice. Slowly, she turned her head toward the hallway, her eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing. But there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. The door to the basement, which had always been locked, was now open. She hadn't gone near it. It had been closed the entire time she'd lived there. And yet, it was ajar, the dark staircase below it beckoning. Lucy's instincts screamed at her to run, to leave this house and never return, but something deep inside her, something primal, forced her feet forward. The whispers were louder now, pulling her toward the basement. It wasn't just curiosity that drove her. It was as though the house itself was calling her, compelling her to come closer. The book, the whispers, the shadows. It was all connected. She reached the doorway to the basement, her fingers trembling as they touched the cool metal of the doorknob. She hesitated, heart pounding in her chest. The air around her seemed to grow colder, more suffocating, but she pushed forward. She had to know. With one final deep breath, she stepped inside. The stairs creaked underfoot as she descended into the darkness. Her phone's flashlight did little to push back the shadows, and the smell of dampness filled the air. Each step took her deeper into the bowels of the house, and with each step, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Lucy, you shouldn't have come." She froze mid-step, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, like it was right behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the same old, familiar basement. She took another step, but her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Was she losing her mind? Then she saw it. At the far end of the basement, on an old wooden table, was a mirror. It was large and ornate, covered in dust, but it glowed faintly in the dark. The reflection in the glass was distorted, flickering like a faulty television screen. As she approached, the reflection shifted. At first, it was just her, standing there in the dark basement, but as she stared deeper, the image in the mirror began to change. Behind her, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A tall, thin figure with glowing eyes. It was her. The figure was mimicking her every move, but it wasn't her. It was someone else. Someone evil. She reached out to touch the mirror, but before her fingers could make contact, the reflection changed again. It grinned at her, a wide, sinister smile that stretched impossibly across its face. And then it spoke. "Lucy, you're mine now." Her breath hitched, her body frozen in terror. She spun around, but the figure wasn't there anymore. The basement was empty. She ran, her footsteps pounding on the stairs, but no matter how fast she moved, the whispers followed, echoing through the house, surrounding her with their chilling call. "Lucy, you can't escape." Lucy couldn't breathe. The walls of the house were closing in on her, suffocating her. The whispering voices echoed through her mind, each word curling around her thoughts like smoke, choking out any sense of clarity. "You can't escape." The words played over and over in her head, like a broken record that wouldn't stop spinning. She had run up the stairs, but the whispers followed her. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was weighing her down, pulling her back to the basement where the mirror had shown her that thing. The figure. Her, but not her. She had to escape. But the more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. Where could she go? The front door was locked. The windows were sealed shut, as though the house didn't want her to leave. No matter how fast she moved, the house always felt the same, empty, quiet, oppressive, but never silent. The whispers filled every corner, every room, and no matter how hard she tried to block them out, they always found their way back. She found herself in the living room, her hands trembling as she ran them over the furniture. Everything felt familiar, too familiar, like the room was suffocating her with its warmth. She looked around, but nothing seemed right. The place she had called home for so long was now alien, twisted. The walls seemed to hum with a low, almost inaudible vibration, like the house was alive and aware of her every movement. Lucy felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and a shiver ran down her spine. She whipped around, heart hammering in her chest, but no one was there. She was alone. She had to be. But was she really? A voice, a new one, spoke from the corner of the room, so faint that she almost didn't hear it at first. But it was there, just out of reach, like a soft sigh on the wind. Lucy. She spun toward the voice, but once again, there was nothing. Just the empty room. Just her own ragged breathing. Was she losing her mind? The room was spinning now. She had to sit down. She collapsed onto the couch, her hands gripping the cushions to steady herself. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, the sensation that something was creeping up behind her, just waiting for her to make a mistake. And then she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Heavy. She opened her eyes. The door to the hallway was ajar, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. Tall. Shadowed. She couldn't see its face, but she knew it was watching her. "Who are you?" Lucy's voice cracked as she spoke. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her body was frozen, as if the air itself was too thick to move through. The figure stepped forward, its silhouette stretching and warping as it moved closer. The light from the street lamp outside caught on something in its hand, a knife, glinting in the dark. Lucy's blood ran cold. No. No, it can't be. It took another step, its footfalls too loud in the silence. The whispers were growing louder again, swirling around her, filling the room with a sound that was almost maddening. "Lucy," the voice was deeper now, richer, more menacing. "You can't hide from me." The figure was nearly upon her now, and she could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on her, suffocating her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around her seemed to slow as she tried to move, to get away, but her limbs were heavy, unresponsive. Suddenly, the figure's face shifted. It became clearer. It was her. But not her. It was twisted, deformed, its features warped into something grotesque, something wrong. The eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. The smile, it was a grin, stretching too wide, too far. "Did you really think you could get away?" the figure whispered, the voice dripping with malice. Lucy tried to scramble backward, but her hands slid against the smooth fabric of the couch, too slick with sweat to find purchase. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with fear, and the oppressive weight of the room was too much. The figure leaned in closer, its smile widening even further, if that was possible. "You're not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." With a final scream, Lucy pushed herself up, her legs finally responding, and she bolted toward the door. The figure didn't chase her, not at first. She heard its footsteps behind her, but it never caught up. She rushed through the hall, her heart racing, but the house seemed endless. The rooms, the walls, they were changing. The hallway she had run through a moment ago was now different. Longer. The doors were different too. Some of them were cracked open, while others were closed, but each one seemed to beckon her, calling her into the darkness beyond. She reached the front door, but it was locked. Of course it was locked. In desperation, Lucy grabbed the nearest object, an old lamp on the table, and hurled it against the door. The glass shattered, but the door remained stubbornly shut. She cursed under her breath, her panic rising as she realized she couldn't escape. The house was trapping her, pushing her further into its depths. And then the whispers returned, louder than ever before. "Lucy," they called her name again, but this time, it wasn't a voice. It was something worse. It was a scream that sounded like her, but deeper, more guttural, filled with rage. She stumbled back, her mind spinning, but the door wouldn't open. She could feel the walls closing in. She could feel the presence behind her, just beyond the door, waiting for her to make a mistake. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Lucy, you're mine. You'll never escape." And that's when Lucy realized something. The house wasn't just alive. It had always been alive. It had always known her, known everything about her. It had been waiting for her to find the book. Waiting for her to unlock whatever it was that had been buried in the walls, in the air, in the very foundation of the house itself. She wasn't just trapped. She was part of it. And the house was never going to let her go. Lucy dropped to her knees, her body shaking uncontrollably as the whispers wrapped around her like chains. She looked at the walls, at the endless hallways that stretched on forever, and knew, with a cold certainty, that there was no escape. The house had claimed her. And now, it was time to take her completely. The house had begun to feel like a living, breathing entity. Every corner she turned, every door she tried to open, seemed to fight her, pushing her further into the depths of its labyrinthine halls. Lucy's mind raced with thoughts, hazy, disjointed, like they were being pulled away from her as she tried to grasp them. She couldn't think straight. The whispers were everywhere. The air around her felt thick and stifling, as if the house was slowly squeezing the life out of her, forcing her to see, to hear, to feel things that weren't really there, or were they? Lucy pressed her palm to the wall as she moved down the dimly lit hallway. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the tension in her chest almost unbearable. The floor beneath her feet creaked with each step she took, a low groan that reverberated through the house, as though the entire structure was sighing with displeasure at her presence. The shadows seemed to stretch and bend in ways that defied logic, and every few seconds, Lucy thought she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A fleeting figure, a flicker of movement in the corner of a room, or a distorted shape where there shouldn't be one. But when she turned to look, nothing was there. She had to get out. She had to get away from this place before it drove her mad. The door she had tried earlier wouldn't open, and now, even though the house felt like it was alive and watching, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister going on. The house wasn't just trapping her. It was keeping her for a reason. Something darker. Something ancient. She stumbled into a room that seemed unfamiliar, but at the same time, strangely familiar. The walls were adorned with dusty, faded portraits of long-forgotten faces. The faces in the portraits were all staring at her, wide-eyed, as if they were frozen in time, pleading for help. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the edge of one of the frames, and the moment she touched it, a cold, tingling sensation ran through her arm. It was like the painting had just come to life. Lucy jerked her hand away, heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't help herself. She had to look closer. She leaned in, her face mere inches from the painting of a woman dressed in black, her eyes hollow and deep. The woman's lips parted slightly, as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Instead, the eyes in the painting seemed to move. Slowly at first, and then faster, blinking, shifting, following Lucy's every move. "Stop," Lucy whispered to herself, trying to pull away, but her body refused to listen. She couldn't look away. She didn't want to. The whispers were growing louder again, and Lucy could hear them now, clearer than ever. They were coming from the painting. From the woman's mouth. "You shouldn't have come here." Her heart skipped a beat. Lucy recoiled, taking several steps back, but the voice, no, the presence, lingered. It was everywhere now. The shadows in the room were closing in on her, tightening like a vice around her throat. The whispers became unintelligible, like 100 voices all speaking at once. Her head throbbed, her vision blurred. She could feel the walls shifting around her, warping in unnatural ways. The room seemed to elongate, stretch, as if the house was breathing in sync with her every movement. She could no longer tell where the walls ended and where the darkness began. The air grew colder. "Help," a voice, so soft and broken, reached her ears. A child's voice. But it didn't sound like it was coming from the room. It came from somewhere deeper, farther within the house. Lucy's legs moved before her mind could catch up, and before she even realized it, she was running, sprinting down the hallway. The voice called out again. "Help me. Lucy." But the moment she reached the doorway to the next room, it slammed shut in her face. The force of it made her stagger backward. She pushed against the door, but it didn't budge. She pulled and pushed, her hands growing raw against the wood. Her breath was a ragged, desperate gasp. She banged her fists against the door, screaming, "Let me out. Please." Then, there was silence. A deep, suffocating silence. And then, that voice again. "Lucy." It was closer now. But how? She looked around. The walls, the door, everything was the same. But that voice was real, and it was just beyond the corner. It was waiting for her. Lucy took a deep breath, steeling herself. She knew she had no choice. She had to confront whatever was in the dark. Slowly, she turned the corner, expecting to see a figure, a shadow, or something else lurking in the darkness. Instead, there was only a small, wooden table, covered in dust and cobwebs. But there was something else, something wrong. A book. The cover was ancient, the pages worn and yellowed, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The title on the front was too faded to read, but the moment her fingers brushed against the cover, the whispers in the room stopped. The world held its breath. Lucy opened the book, despite the creeping dread building in her chest. The pages were blank. But as she flipped through them, something caught her eye, a single line, written in dark, flowing ink on the last page. "You can never leave." She froze. Her body went numb as she stared at the words. The cold from the room deepened, crawling up her spine. The walls creaked. The house groaned. And then, from the shadows, the figure appeared again. But this time, it wasn't just any figure. It was her. But it wasn't her. It was the same deformed reflection she had seen earlier, standing behind her in the hallway. "Leave," the figure whispered, its lips twisting into a smile that didn't belong on a human face. "You're already gone." Lucy screamed, but the room felt like it was swallowing the sound. Everything around her began to blur, the edges of reality itself fraying. The book in her hand began to burn, the pages curling as if they were being consumed by fire. She tried to drop it, but it was too late. The flames spread up her arm, her skin blistering under the heat. She was trapped again, but this time, she felt the cold weight of the house's grasp tightening around her. The figure reached out, its hands stretching unnaturally long, and with a sickening crack, it grabbed her wrist, pulling her into the black void. The world disappeared. Lucy's body felt like it was being pulled underwater, the pressure mounting as her vision blurred in and out. The hand, the twisted, gnarled hand, clutched her wrist tightly, its fingers like talons digging into her skin. The world around her swirled, the house spinning, as though everything was unraveling in an instant. She could feel the cold, dark presence enveloping her, suffocating her from all sides, and every step she tried to take felt like it was dragging her deeper into the abyss. Her heart was pounding so loudly in her chest that she could hear nothing else. She was losing grip on everything, on herself, on reality. Her head was spinning, her breath ragged and shallow. She looked around in desperation, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no escape. The shadows around her were closing in. The walls of the house, if they could even be called walls anymore, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, contracting and expanding like lungs taking in and expelling air. The very fabric of the house was alive, and it was feeding off her fear. Her eyes were drawn to the figure that had emerged from the darkness. It stood in the corner of the room, impossibly still, but its presence was suffocating. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure was no longer just a shadow, it was a man, or at least, it resembled one. A tall, thin silhouette with unnaturally long limbs and a face that was wrong. His eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, black voids, like two pits that sucked in all light. His smile was grotesque, wide and stretched too far across his face, as if it was painted on in a cruel mockery of humanity. "Lucy," The voice came in a low, rasping whisper that seemed to crawl under her skin. It was as though it came from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling her head with a million conflicting thoughts. "You're mine now. You'll never leave." The words shattered what little composure she had left. She tried to pull away from the hand gripping her wrist, but it was useless. It was like it had fused with her skin, the pain radiating up her arm as if the fingers were sinking into her very bones. Her heart raced even faster, threatening to burst from her chest. She had to escape, had to get out, but no matter how hard she fought, she couldn't break free. The house, no, the entity inside it, was too strong. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me go." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly raised one long, spindly hand and pointed a finger at her, as if accusing her of some unspeakable crime. The air grew heavier, colder, and the shadows twisted and stretched, forming faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, emerging from the walls, the ceiling, the very floor. They had no bodies, just faces. Contorted faces of agony, their mouths open in eternal screams, their eyes wide in terror. They stared at Lucy with an intensity that froze her blood, their silent screams louder than any noise she had ever heard. And then, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, voices overlapping, speaking in a language she couldn't understand but still somehow felt in her bones. "Stay, stay, you belong to us." It was as if the house was speaking to her, weaving its dark, twisted words into her mind. The figure took a slow step forward. Each movement it made was deliberate, its long limbs stretching unnaturally with each step. The floor creaked beneath its weight as if protesting the intrusion. Lucy's pulse quickened. There was no more room to run, no place to hide. The walls were closing in on her, the shadows thickening until they enveloped her completely. Her throat tightened, and she gasped for breath. The air was thick with decay, the smell of something ancient and rotten filling her nostrils. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming, its grin growing wider, its black eyes boring into her soul. "You should have never come here," it whispered again, its voice dripping with malice. The words sank deep into Lucy's mind, wrapping around her thoughts like chains. She tried to scream again, but no sound escaped. She was trapped, stuck in the center of this nightmare, with no way out. But then, something shifted. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the walls seemed to sway as if the very foundation of the house was unstable. The shadows that had been closing in around her now receded, like the tide pulling away from the shore. For a moment, the pressure in the room lifted, and Lucy thought she might be free. She took a shaky step back, her body trembling with exhaustion. But as she did, she noticed something that sent ice through her veins. The figure wasn't alone anymore. In the darkness, more figures emerged. They were all around her now, their eyes glowing faintly in the blackness. Some were human, others were not, twisted, monstrous shapes that lurked in the corners of the room, watching her with cruel, hungry eyes. She could feel them watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She wasn't alone anymore, either. A voice, familiar and distant, echoed in her mind, her mother's voice. "Run, Lucy. Run, before it's too late." It was too late. Lucy had no choice now but to face what was coming. The house, this place, was hungry. And she was its prey. The room seemed to pulse around her, the walls moving as if they were breathing. The ceiling began to lower, and the floor seemed to open up beneath her feet. Lucy could feel the cold wind, the chill of death itself, as the shadows reached for her, grasping at her legs, pulling her down into the dark abyss. She clawed at the air, trying to reach for something, anything, to pull herself free. But the more she struggled, the deeper she sank. The ground cracked open, and from the gaping maw below, a cold, skeletal hand reached out, grabbing hold of her ankle. She screamed in terror, trying to kick free, but the grip tightened, and the darkness below seemed to grow louder, a roaring, howling wind that threatened to consume her whole. With one final scream, she was dragged into the void. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the twisted grin of the figure watching her, its hollow eyes filled with an ancient, empty hunger. Lucy was gone. The house had claimed her, and there was no escape. But something lingered in the darkness. Something was stirring. The house was not finished with her. Not yet. Lucy's eyes fluttered open. At first, everything was hazy, the world spinning like a broken compass, unable to find direction. Her body felt heavy, as though it had been weighted down with stone. Her mind was a blur, disjointed fragments of images, sounds, and sensations that had no place in reality. Slowly, as her eyes adjusted, she realized she was no longer in the house. She wasn't sure where she was, but something about the place felt wrong. The walls were damp, the air thick with an oppressive chill that crawled along her skin like the fingers of 1,000 unseen hands. There was no light, no warmth, just an endless stretch of cold concrete around her. She sat up, her heart racing as her mind scrambled to piece together what had happened. Had it all been a dream? The house, the figure, the shadows, had it been real? The remnants of the terror still clung to her, like a lingering stench that refused to fade. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she forced herself to stand, but the moment her feet touched the cold floor, a shiver ran up her spine, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Turning around, her breath caught in her throat. The darkness, no, something, moved. A figure emerged from the shadows, its silhouette sharp and unnatural, its presence sending waves of cold dread crashing into her chest. It was not the same figure from before. No, this one was something new, something even more menacing. Its shape was constantly shifting, like it couldn't decide what form it wanted to take, but there was one thing about it that remained constant: the eyes. They were glowing, faintly at first, but as it drew closer, they burned with a malevolent intensity that made Lucy's skin crawl. The eyes were a deep, unnatural red, like coals burning in the heart of an inferno. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her pulse quickened. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The figure, whatever it was getting closer, its footsteps unnervingly silent. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with each step it took. Lucy, the voice was a whisper at first, a voice that slithered into her mind like a poisonous serpent. Lucy, you thought you could escape. She tried to take a step back, but her legs betrayed her, her knees shaking so violently that she could barely stand. The creature stepped forward, the red eyes now burning into her soul, and for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in its gaze. Recognition. It knew her. It knew everything about her. And it wanted something from her. "What do you want?" she gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. The figure paused, its shape shifting again. It seemed to consider her question, and then, with a voice that was almost sadistic in its calmness, it spoke again. "Everything." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to scream, to run, but the words died on her tongue as the creature reached out with a long, bony hand. It wasn't even a hand, more like a mass of tendrils, each one writhing with an eerie, unnatural movement. The tips of the tendrils brushed against her skin, and the moment they touched her, a shockwave of cold ran through her body. It felt like ice had replaced her veins, and the world around her began to distort. The creature leaned in closer, its face now just inches from hers. The red eyes burned brighter, and Lucy could see something dark, something ancient, swimming within them. The creature's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, its mouth opening in a way that defied nature, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. "I've been waiting for you, Lucy," it said, its voice low and guttural. "We've all been waiting for you." The words echoed in her mind, a steady drumbeat of fear that grew louder with every passing second. There was something else in the air now, something thick, suffocating. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, pooling at the corners like hungry creatures, waiting to feast. Lucy's pulse raced. She couldn't think. Her body screamed for her to run, but her feet were frozen in place, her legs incapable of obeying her commands. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and every time she exhaled, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows inching closer, wrapping around her like chains. The figure stepped back, its form becoming more solid, more defined. But the eyes, they were still there, still watching, still burning. Lucy's thoughts were spinning. She was trapped. There was no escape. The darkness had her in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It tilted its head to the side, as if it was studying her, weighing her worth. Then it spoke again, its voice no longer a whisper, but something deeper, something darker. "You don't remember, do you?" it asked. "You don't remember how you got here? How you were chosen?" The words hung in the air like poison, and Lucy's stomach churned. The memories were foggy, but as she tried to recall them, she realized something was wrong. She couldn't remember. There were gaps in her mind, pieces of her past that didn't fit, moments that felt out of place. How had she gotten here? How had she ended up in this room, facing this thing? She opened her mouth to speak, but the creature held up a hand, silencing her. Its smile returned, wider this time, impossibly wide. "You will," it whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against bone. "You'll remember. And when you do, you'll wish you hadn't." With that, the figure stepped backward into the shadows, its form fading into the blackness. The air grew still, and for a moment, Lucy thought it had all been a dream. But as she turned to look around the room, she saw the shadows still clinging to the walls, still watching her, waiting. Something wasn't right. The room around her began to distort again, the walls warping and stretching as if they were alive, bending and twisting with an unnatural force. The very foundation of the building seemed to shift, and the floor beneath her feet cracked open like a wound, revealing a yawning chasm of blackness below. Lucy stumbled back, her heart racing. What was happening? She had to escape. But how? Where was she supposed to go? The door, there was no door. The room had no way out. The shadows reached for her again, this time with more force, more intent. Her mind screamed. She needed to get out. She needed to find a way. But the more she struggled, the tighter the darkness wrapped around her, pulling her in, suffocating her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, a voice, a familiar voice, whispered in her ear. "Lucy, you're not alone." She froze. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. No one. The shadows shifted again, and this time, Lucy could feel it. Something was coming. Something far worse than anything she had imagined. And it was coming for her. The house, the darkness, it wasn't finished with her. Not yet. And whatever was about to happen next, she knew one thing for certain, there would be no escape. Not anymore. Lucy's chest heaved as she tried to steady her breath. The room felt smaller, more oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in on her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, spreading out like ink in water, until they completely engulfed the space around her. Every step she took was met with a screeching, echoing sound, like the building itself was groaning under the weight of her presence. The whispering voice, now louder, was everywhere. "Lucy." It slithered into her ears, a cold breeze following its path, leaving a trail of goosebumps on her skin. Her heart beat in her throat, and her hands trembled uncontrollably as she fumbled for something to hold on to, anything to steady herself. The room, once dark and oppressive, was now shifting. The very air seemed to pulse with a rhythm, one that echoed with a deep, guttural growl, as if something massive and ancient was awakening. And then, from the center of the room, a shape began to form. At first, it was indistinct, an outline against the swirling darkness, but it quickly became more defined. Its silhouette was human-like but distorted, as though it had been pulled from a nightmare. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were thin, too thin, as if they could snap at any moment. The face that emerged from the shadows was horrifying, pale, almost translucent, with eyes so black that they swallowed the light. There were no pupils, no whites, just infinite darkness. It moved closer, dragging its fingers across the walls. Each touch left a trail of deep, jagged gashes in the surface, as though the walls themselves were being torn apart from the inside. Lucy backed away, her legs shaking so violently that she could barely stand. But the figure, no, thing, didn't stop. It moved with horrifying slowness, like a predator savoring the chase, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. "You thought you could escape," it said, its voice low, the sound like something scraping across glass. "You thought you could run." Lucy's breath came in short gasps. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice cracking with fear. "What do you want?" The thing smiled. Or at least, it seemed to. Its lips pulled back in an eerie, exaggerated grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to stretch too far back into its throat. "I want everything," it whispered, its voice now right behind her, close enough to make her skin crawl. "Your memories, your fears, your soul. You're mine now." The words hit her like a physical blow, and a cold, paralyzing dread gripped her chest. She tried to run, to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was trapped, stuck in a nightmare that seemed to stretch on forever. The thing stepped closer, its breath foul and thick like rotting earth, and Lucy could feel her vision beginning to fade at the edges, her limbs growing heavier with each passing second. It reached out for her, its bony fingers grazing her shoulder, sending a shock of ice through her body. The instant its touch made contact, the world around her seemed to warp. The walls bent and twisted, as if reality itself was being unraveled, and the shadows surged forward, swallowing everything whole. "Please, no," Lucy gasped, but the words felt foreign in her mouth. It was as though her voice wasn't even her own anymore, lost in the darkness. The thing's grin widened impossibly, revealing more teeth. It laughed, a guttural, rasping sound that sent a chill so deep through her bones that she thought she might freeze from the inside out. "You have no idea what you've awoken," it hissed. "This isn't just me. This is only the beginning." Suddenly, the room collapsed, and Lucy was no longer standing. She was falling. Falling into a vast, empty space where there was no light, no sound, only the crushing weight of isolation. Her limbs felt weightless, her body floating in the endless void, but she couldn't move. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, to cling to, but there was nothing. Just the blackness. And then, she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, their faces pale and twisted, their eyes glowing like embers. They floated around her in the darkness, their hollow stares fixated on her. These were the lost souls, the ones the creature had taken before her. And now, she was one of them. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. A voice, the same as before, echoed around her. "It's your turn now, Lucy. We've been waiting." The figures slowly moved closer, their hands reaching for her, their fingers long and skeletal, brushing against her skin like cobwebs. Every touch sent a ripple of terror through her soul. She felt herself being pulled into the darkness. It was like being dragged through thick tar, every movement slow and painful. The figures surrounded her, their hands now gripping her arms, her legs, pulling her deeper into the endless abyss. And just before the darkness consumed her entirely, she heard the voice again, right in her ear. "Welcome to eternity, Lucy." And then, silence. The story ended with a scream, but it was not Lucy's. It was the voice of something far worse, echoing through the endless void, waiting for its next victim. And somewhere in the distance, in the deepest corners of the universe, the shadows stirred, hungering for more. The darkness was never truly gone. It just waited. Waiting, for you. As the shadows reclaimed their silence, the darkness lingers, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. The nightmare never truly ends, it only begins again.